Greetings, citizens! Justiguy has arrived. As you probably know, I like me my Shadowverse. But if you don't know that, then hey, I like me my Shadowverse. And now that you're up to speed on that front, I'll let you in on a pretty shocking secret. I've been playing very little Shadowverse lately. And not just because I've been working on development of my visual novel either. But, shameless plug aside, the reason is actually because I've been, well, playing Hearthstone lately instead. Pretty crazy, huh? Or maybe not. If you're a Shadowverse player yourself, maybe you've also been feeling like something's been off with the game as of late. Or maybe you've just been feeling burnt out between chests and the other events going on. I don't know. For me, Shadowverse has felt like maybe it's been heading in an odd direction for a couple of expansions now. Which is a real shame considering it felt like the introduction of the choose mechanic back in Dawnbreak Night Edge, and that whole expansion in general, in fact, was a tremendous step in the right direction. Well, one complaint that pops up very often regarding Shadowverse is the lack of interaction, that it's all about drawing well and playing your super mega ultra combo before the other player can. Now, maybe there's some truth to this, but I think this is to some degree true of most card games, so that's not really what I want to focus on. And as we head into this season of mini expansion reveals, which is going to be quickly followed by reveals for the next expansion proper, I've been thinking about what kind of cards will be coming up next, how the game will be shaken up further, more to the point, how the game will attract players and get them to spend their money. Rotation in particular is going to be really different once we lose Starforged Legends, though that's probably a topic of discussion worth a video all its own. Now, backtracking a bit, Choose felt like a really positive addition to the game. It was a fair, unique mechanic that added a lot of depth, at least I thought so. Accelerate was a little less so, especially with how the cards with it ended up being distributed and how they worked, but it seems like it's eventually balanced itself out. So what about the future? Is it another mechanic altogether we need, or something more? Well, given new mechanics are shiny and they probably sell more, I suspect we'll be hearing about one of those, but I actually think it's the latter that could really spice up Shadowverse more than anything. So to kick this video off, yeah right, how long have I been talking now? There are two cards in particular that I want to talk about, then I want to talk about two more and a few that have rotated out. These are cards that I think the game could really use more of. Cards of a variety that I feel could really spice the game up. The first of these cards is Dragon Cleaver Roy from Dawnbreak Night Edge, and the second is Octrice from the recently released Omen of the Ten. Now, Roy at a glance isn't the most unique choose card. He's a 3 play point follower that gives you either some ramp or a spell that does some damage. It's pretty straightforward. Well, that is, except for that one, seemingly inexplicable addition to Dragon Strife Blade that follows the main effect. The main effect, of course, is just do 3 damage to an enemy follower. You know, that's fine. However, then it says, if that follower is a Dragoncraft follower, deal 6 damage instead. Now, don't get me wrong, I think Roy's effect is already decent on its own, but this addition is just plain interesting. How many cards in Shadowverse work like this? I honestly can't think of that many, if any at all, actually. Roy is a card that already works, like, it works. But then it provides something extra when you're playing a mirror match, when you're playing against a specific class. It's a boon so potentially powerful that it could decide which card you want to pick. A card that you might not pick otherwise, depending on what class you're playing. No, perhaps Roy and Dragon Strife Blade aren't the kind of direct interaction players are asking for when they bring this up. But personally, I find the card fascinating. It's an effect that you will only get when your opponent has a specific thing in play. An interaction that will only occur if your opponent is doing something fairly specific, all things considered. And so, I don't know about you, but I think that's certainly a form of interaction, isn't it? More to the point, it's a form of interaction Shadowverse could potentially have and use more of in the future. So that in mind, let's look to Octrice, a card that similarly fascinates me. Now, they could have just made her an 8-cost follower with her enhance effects being her default ones. It would have worked well enough, but instead, Cygames opted for something different, going along with the looting theme of these Swordcraft cards in an entirely different way. Octrice's primary effect, whether or not you use her enhance effect, allows her to steal the last words of any enemy follower, no matter what their class is. Again, this is an effect that will only kick off through what the opponent has out. if they even have anything out. This can in turn disrupt them in a unique way that Shadowverse otherwise just kinda lacks. So what I'm getting at is this. Rather than printing even more bonkers or memey legends, rather than adding even more mechanics to the ever-growing list of mechanics this game has, I think it might be more beneficial for Shadowverse's future, for Shadowverse's players, to try and see what it could do with more cards like these in the future. Cards with unique effects that might not always do something. Cards with situational effects that aren't broken, but could totally destroy your opponent in that one really specific situation that it actually works. Now sure, adding some more tech cards like Fall from Grace and Seraphic Blade also wouldn't hurt, but that's probably as likely as the mini expansion adding more Serpent support for Blood. Now anyway, I said there were two more cards, and then some cards that had rotated out, so what about that second pair of cards? Well, as far as these cards go, one is a card that I think most players will be fairly familiar with, and the other not so much. So given that, I'll list them in that order. First up is everyone's favorite little legendary Lococo, Little Puppeteer. If you're unaware, what Lococo does is pretty simple and horrifying. She's a basic 2/2 that costs 2 play points, but if you use her Enhance effect, she can transform any enemy follower of her choosing into a teddy bear that generates puppets for you. Yeah, and to be fair, this one is more like other transformation cards out there, which aren't as specific as the ones I've been talking about, so maybe it doesn't belong on this list. Still, it does require there to be some kind of interaction with an enemy card to work, so I think it's worth mentioning all the same. Of course, on that note, one of those tech cards I mentioned just a bit ago, Fall from Grace, is unique for actually the opposite reason, because it can target any card, not just an opponent's, which is actually something Shadowverse kinda lacks also. Most cards are very specific on targeting enemy cards, so maybe having cards with effects that could target you, or your own cards, would be something else they could consider. I digress though. Let's talk about that second card and then I'll get to wrapping things up. Now the second card is also from Portalgraph. This one is Morton the Manipulator, and it's a card that I think is just bananas. At first, what Morton does is nothing, because he's got an evolve effect. And should you evolve him, you can not only banish any enemy follower that costs 2 play points or less, but you can summon a copy of it for yourself as well. And yeah, you might see this and think, wow, how situational, but that's kind of the point of this video, so hush up, alright? Also, believe it or not, there are actually quite a few cards right now, just in rotation alone, that might make this guy worth considering before he rotates in a few months. For starters, Bloodcraft alone is packing quite a few deadly 2-drop followers for you to steal. In fact, just Vera by herself might make it worth it. But then Dragoncraft is also carrying quite a few low-cost followers these days, especially in PDK decks. Sword and Forest are both full of low-cost followers. Shadow's got quite a few it likes to rely on these days with Arcus shenanigans running rampant, and even Haven's got its share of them now. Not to mention the kind of shenanigans you could probably pull in a Portal Mirror. No, maybe it's not the best card in the world, but it is a card that is unique and has a potentially devastating effect in the right situations. And I think that's the kind of card Shadowverse could really use more of. Not some stuff that's just obviously great at a glance, like Phelen and Vera are, but cards that you might just bring along and make your opponent go, "What? You brought that? It's not possible!" when you pull it off, when you use it. That might be what Shadowverse really needs when you get down to it. Not less broken cards, and maybe not even more unique specific cards. Maybe it just needs more in general. More archetypes, more broken, ridiculous shenanigans. Just more, you know? Well, okay, maybe I don't. Or maybe I do. You tell me. Regardless, those are the cards in rotation that I wanted to talk about, at least all the ones I can think of anyway. So on that note, before I go, I do want to briefly touch on some of the older cards that did this kind of thing, or something similar to what I've been talking about here. First of them was Dramatic Dragonblader from Wonderland Dreams. This was a ridiculous 5/6, 3-cost ward, but her effect was that she would summon an enemy dragon, but then she could banish it if she evolved. Again, this is an effect that involves direct interaction with the opponent, or at least the opponent's board. Maybe it's not the most well-designed take on this idea, but there are ways to work around it. With cards to recover evolution points out there, as well as just having the option to wait until your opponent's board is full, I can definitely see some uses for it. Then, also from Wonderland Dreams, you had the lovely Black Swan and White Swan and Shadowcraft and Havencraft respectively. These would summon their respective counterpart for your opponent, which then granted you a free evolution. And these were both pretty good and unique cards in my opinion. There was a risk involved, that being giving your opponent a potentially really good card if you didn't kill it right away. But the reward of the evolved follower with that effect, if you pulled it off, was really, really good also. Also, the idea of just bringing in extra classes to the mix is pretty cool. You could be suddenly giving, say, a Bloodcraft player a Havencraft follower that could start healing them up out of nowhere if you're going to be playing the Havencraft card, you know? It's really cool, I think. And back in Rage of Bahamut, we also had Anne and Greya in Runecraft and Dragoncraft. Cards which, despite being in different classes, could summon the other one. This was another cool concept that never really went anywhere outside of Runecraft's occasional add a random one of these cards to your hand cards. But it's a similar idea that Cygames might want to think about someday. Now, will we ever actually see cards like this in Shadowverse again? I don't know. Considering how recent Octreus is, I'd like to think that they might do more considering how she's received, but who can say? Right now, Omen of the Tens mini expansion is looking, well, it's not looking likely so far, with a disgusting Holy Lion legendary kicking things off after a Mimi Portalcraft one, but maybe they'll surprise us. I gotta admit, I am kinda digging Runecraft's new Golem. Well, that's enough about me. What do you think, citizens? Are you happy with the current state of Shadowverse? Would you like to see more cards with unique, specific effects like these? And if so, what kinds of effects would you like to see in particular? You got some ideas? You know, share them! And perhaps most importantly of all, anyone else have their fingers crossed for a second Fate Stay Night tie-in once the second Heaven to Spheal movie comes around? Whatever you feel, however you feel, let me know. I can only speak for myself, and I might be totally, completely off base with how the game feels right now to other players. I am just a guy, after all. So with all that said, I'm afraid that this is going to have to be...